Thanks. I'm so glad to be here, guys. I'm going to start by shamelessly plugging my contact info and social media handle. Follow me, I'll follow you. But more importantly, feel free to reach out if you ever have any questions about the work. If you guys, I know you guys are all working artists and starting off your career as artists, and so if you want some feedback or critique on your work, or if you guys just want to discuss continuing your education after PSAD and what that might look for you, right? So when Randy asked me to do an artist talk, I was like, okay, we have to actually, I have to go dig down in the bowels of my Facebook and find pictures of my time at Paducah School of Art and Design. And so not only did I find me right outside of the sculpture building, but Randy's intro to drawing class, 8 a.m. baby, like all of us together. And so it's funny, like I'm adjuncting now at Murray State and teaching a drawing one class. And if you guys have Randy, you know, it's like he's just constantly saying, push your values, push your values. And that's literally all I do. I just walk around all day saying, push your values, push your values. So it comes full circle always. And so I wanted to open with a thank you to Randy and Paul and all the folks here at PSAD for having me. It's just been an honor to like be back roaming these halls and seeing what everyone's up to, seeing new faces and meeting new faces, but also seeing old ones. And so it's just also interesting to think about how this place has been the foundation or the building blocks of the work that you see on the walls today. And I think it's really fun to bring it back full circle. Like Randy said, I was with the first round of students that graduated in this building. And so we were downtown on Broadway. And I remember there being like literally chunks like falling from the ceiling as we were drawing. And then we move into this building and it's just, everything's brand new and beautiful. And so now I'm having the chance to exhibit my work in this beautiful space and talk to all of you about it while I'm surrounded by it. So I'm just really excited. So I love going to other artist talks and listening to artists talk about their upbringing, kind of like their origin story, right? And so while the work doesn't always necessarily have to be about that upbringing, I feel that where we grow up and how we're raised and where we're raised really helps influence the work, right? I believe that we're the sum of all of our experience, and you can say the same thing about our art making, right? And so while buried, my work talks a lot about, has those layers of family and thinking about the family dynamic that we have. So you can see on the left here, that's my mom and my very tired father. And so when they met, my dad had kids, my mom had a kid, and they got together and then they had me. It was like a yours, mine, and ours situation kind of thing. And so it was always just this really hectic, crazy house where not only was it like this open door policy of all of the neighborhood kids and cousins coming inside, my mom always had the refrigerator stocked and was just a very warm and opening house. And then on top of that, she ran a daycare. So it was pretty crazy thinking about how I grew up in a place with absolutely no personal space, no decompression time, and how if you knew me personally today, I'm the same exact way. I'm always like, go, go, go. My boyfriend always says that if he left me long enough in a room by myself, I'd start talking to the walls. And so it's funny how that kind of goes with me, right? I grew up in a little town in northern Michigan. If we look at the thing right here, right up here. And so to the east was Lake Huron, giant, beautiful blue waters. And then we were surrounded by the Huron National Forest. So I grew up really like connected to nature, and that being a huge part of the way I learned things. And I think that seclusion that came with that set me up in some ways for failure, right? But with other opportunities that I feel like people from like larger cities and suburbs didn't experience. that coupled with having a large family is, I think, really interesting. You can see to the right here, this is us all grown up now. A lot of these people have had kids. This gal, my little sister, actually just called me a couple weeks ago, and she's pregnant. We're growing and growing and growing and expanding. And so very family oriented, inspired by that. Also, both of my parents were working artists. My father is a basket weaver, not underwater, just regular. And my mother is an amazing oil painter. And so you can see to the left here, growing up in a place where we were surrounded by forests, a lot of the time we would spend weekends going on really long hikes with my dad, and we would cut down young black ash trees and drag them back to our house, where then we would soak them. And you can see here where he's pounding the log and it creates strips that then he would build these really ornate baskets with. We would also collect animal bones, other natural fibers, cattails, red osier, all of those things, then bring them back and make baskets together. And so watching somebody make work that took hundreds of hours in each piece by the time making the material and putting it together, and then on top of that, years of perfecting that craft, was really just amazing to see, along with my mother and having the patience of an oil painter, right, and waiting for layers to dry. Both of them being self-taught artists who practiced and were all things that I witnessed as a kid and take with me today in the way I make work, right? And so this drive to always keep creating, right? Like I'm asked every once in a while, like, Lou, why do you make art? And I'm like, I really can't help myself. Like I've always just done it. And there's always just been this natural inclination to work with my hands and keep making, right? It's honestly like a really weird, selfish thing when you think about art making. So just parents that kept me motivated and driven to keep creating, I think was a really amazing part of my art practice. So a lot's happened since graduating from PSAD. I then went on to get my bachelor's from Murray State University in December of 2019. And I did a double emphasis in printmaking and in sculpture. So when I was here at Paducah School of Art and Design, Cody Arnall was the sculpture professor here. And he, along with others, was teaching me those fundamentals, right? Those basic design skills and things like that, but also thinking more deeply about material and material investigation and how that can add to the content of our work, right? And so I was really fascinated with how sculpture can do that, and working in the round and working with installation pieces, right? And so then I went on to Murray State, where I took a printmaking class with Nicole Hand and really fell in love with that process as well, right? Like the idea of a matrix, repetition, multiplicity, that was all really exciting opportunities in the work, while taking those elements of sculpture and thinking about material choices and how the two can merge together. And so I was using, you can see on the left here, these are brooms and mops and dusters that are flocked with dirt that I collected from my home. And so my work was talking a lot about the idea of domestic labor, the mundane, household tasks like chores and cleaning and laundry prep. I was living with my boyfriend. We just moved in together. And so I was thinking a lot more about domestic gender roles in the United States and how those things are constantly changing and shifting. And I'll be honest, I was also just worn out. I was working 30 hours a week. I was going to school full time. I was keeping my house, or trying to keep my house up to my standards of clean. Didn't always work, all while trying to have a social life. And I was like, how do other women do this with like children and a whole family? How did my mother do this? It was pretty crazy, right? And so thinking about those things while making these installation works, thinking about non-traditional matrices like the iron, right? And how an iron can, we don't necessarily have to use ink to make a mark, right? And how those can kind of merge, right? So I've always kind of instinctively created work that talks about that domestic space, right? And our roles in it and how those are changing. And in earlier works at Murray State, it was much more a critique about those roles. Living in a patriarchal society where burdens of that labor are biased, right? And so my opinions on that matter haven't necessarily wavered, although my relationship with my domestic space has. So during the beginning months of the pandemic, I had the luxury of being able to stay safe in my home for those months, right? Something that a lot of people around the world did not have. And soon after that, I moved away for graduate school, where I would be, in so many words, homesick for another 3 years after that. And so that experience kind of changed my perspective about my private space and how I want to create work about it. So during the height of the pandemic, literally March of 2020, I accepted a graduate assistantship at LSU in Baton Rouge, and it was absolutely terrifying, right? I ended up having to move to a place that I had never been before. My landlord was a woman that this guy gave me her phone number, and her name was Miss Cindy. And she was at least 90 years old, and she sent me text messages of a blurry apartment and was like, "You ready to sign the lease?" And I was like, "Sounds good." So it was pretty crazy. So I moved to LSU, with a U-Haul, crying the entire way, and to a place that I'd never been before, to an apartment that I'd only seen blurry photos of. And it was a extremely vulnerable time during a pandemic, right? But I ended up really loving it. I made some of the best friends that I'll ever have in this life there. I got to teach. My job was literally just to make art. Like, that's what they paid me to do. And be in the shop and working with others. And so I think that was just an amazing experience to say that I had. And I came out on the other side a much stronger person, a tougher skin, if you would. Then I get there, right? And I'm going through my stuff and trying to organize what I want to make and how I want my work to be different than it was in undergrad. I knew I wanted to add color to my work because it was all literally made of dirt and burnt iron parts and stuff like that. And so I was like, I want to add color. I want to work with textiles. All of these things that I kind of was like, I don't know what's going on and I'm scared, but I'm going to set goals for myself. And so years ago, I found this box of women's stockings at this local thrift store. And this is the part where I think it's funny. Like, when your parents or your significant other, whoever, gets after you for your art hoarding, and you're like, I need to keep this. I don't know why, but I got to keep it for the next 5 years. Because you never know when eventually you're going to make an entire body of work out of that entire box of stockings, right? So I go in, they're $5, and I'm like, I'm just going to buy these just in case. And I kept them forever. I think I bought them while I was still at Murray State, and I had had them for like 3 or 4 years. But I knew even at the time, I was really intrigued by the range of these fabricated skin tones, like fake skin tones and textures that they held. But I was also thinking a lot about their intended purposes, right? Like to constrict and transform and conceal the female body. And so I'm in my studio and I'm trying to just get through my artist block and be like, okay, what are we doing here? And so I have my pillow stuffing and this cotton that I was making paper with, and I began stuffing them, some exaggerated, some lightly, and others stretching them and knotting them and ripping them. And the result was this giant mass of indiscernible soft forms in the middle of my tiny studio that resembled like parts of a human body, such as limbs, intestines, breasts, potatoes. Some people just call my potato art, right? And so over the course of making that body of work, I would use the forms across multiple mediums: drawings, embroidery, my sculptural work that you see, various photo processes. And I began by using them to create these soft sculptures and still lifes that incorporated those domestic items, right? The curtain tassels, plant stands, pearls. And so using those domestic patterns and objects and textures combined with those weird potato abstracted forms created this really interesting narrative of like opposites attracting, hard versus soft, familiar versus unfamiliar, that I was really interested in. And the beginning thoughts of using domestic items to create that environment to bring that viewer into the private space that I like to talk about in my work, right? This was the beginning of grad school. So, that time, while very experimental, was really crucial to the content and process seen in my work today, right? And so I think whenever, this is to be said, like whenever we're having artist block or we're not quite sure what's going on, I think the key is to keep making through that, right? And to keep challenging yourself, and you're like, I'm picking up these, I'm thinking about this while I'm making this, and that's all going to show up in the work eventually, right? And experiment, get weird with it, right? It doesn't all have to make sense. And so I then took the weird lumps, and I began documenting myself interacting with the soft sculpture forms. And I found that the performance aspects held a ton of really great artistic opportunities. And so in an attempt to hone in on those qualities of the performances, I was documenting myself doing just odd things with them, balancing them on my head, breastfeeding them, stuffing into the really small spaces, just anything and everything, and just taking tons of reference images. And so I'm interacting with these unrecognizable forms that inadvertently become more of like extensions of my body. And then therefore my body, its fats, its innards, blurring this line between reality, what's reality and what's fiction, right? And so the compositions make the purpose of the forms and my interactions with them kind of ambiguous, right? You can perceive them as extensions of my body, or they can be invasions, right? So am I fighting or am I complying with them? There's no real answer, right? It's just this idea of this interaction. And it created this really, I think, interesting narrative of overgrowth and the carrying of the forms that engages in those heightened awarenesses of the body and these notions of vulnerability and burden and accumulation that are reoccurring themes in my work. Overgrowth and repetition, thinking about printmaking, right, and as well as sculptural works, are a large part of the work. And the idea to create these like emotive and compositional opportunities, right, that I was still working through and trying to think about and how it could all fit together. At the same time, so while I'm doing this weird reference photo stuff over here, I'm also going to all of the wonderful estate sales in Baton Rouge and going to thrift stores and finding all of these really lovely old vintage linens, right? And I was first really interested in their decorative patterns and how they kind of naturally create a frame simply as a means for the embroidery work and the reference images with the embroidery work. But then I started thinking a little bit harder about that, right? Like many of these linens come with their own memories, such as stains or rips that I found really intriguing in terms of like mark making and the history, like mark making history and leaving a mark, along with the history of each linen, right? So the original use of the linens suggests that past intimacy with our own bodies. Whether that be a handkerchief to console someone, or a napkin to wipe sweat or food off the face, or even just table setting to think about like the ritual of setting prepared food onto them. And then therefore the ritual of like coming together and eating together as a family. And so those dated patterns and materials spoke to those antiquated connotations of the material and the perceived former roles of the discarded linens, And then I started then thinking about the proverbial woman that had handled and cared for them before me, right? Where did they come from? I also used other repurposed textiles and items specific to the home. I was using bed sheets, so this is me wrapped in my bed sheets. I was using table linens, pillow stuffing, like you can see in the sculptural work, lace curtains, you can see that through the digital works and stuff like that. Because of their, I think the idea of like this interesting preconceived role that they have and this intimate nature, we found we like in bed sheets, like the act of sleeping in them, concealing ourselves, wiping our tears, and thinking more about this direct contact they have with our bodies that leaves this memory that doesn't always have a physical mark, right? So like a baby blanket, right? A baby blanket is technically just a piece of fabric, right? But you've wrapped your child in it for years and years and years and watched them grow out of it. And a lot of times people keep those baby blankets and they become more than just a piece of fabric. And so what do these regular household linens also carry? That the same could be said for a baby blanket, right? While some of the linens exhibit notable stains or rips showing that interaction, others existed unmarred but still hold that notion of human touch. Many of the linens also came with embroidered designs from their former owners, mysterious stains from use, and others were so delicate they were more likely purchased for a special occasion that's long since passed, like something like this, right? And I began thinking about this idea of unintentionally passing down these linens. Let's face it, this was probably, they were bought by somebody or given to a woman that had a house and she's either passed or too old to manage them anymore. And I went to her house and went to the estate sale, and Lou Colby picks them up and takes them to her studio and gives them a whole new life, right? And so thinking of this really interesting, like unintentional collaboration between myself and these past generations. And so I'm also thinking about it like as far as embroidery work and textiles, right? And the history of that is like a more female-dominated medium. That long lineage of female artists working in that medium and questioning those perceived gender roles and experiences that I think is important when you're making the work. The repetitive nature of sewing and putting hours and hours into touching the items and the linens that I think comes into the work and content. You also notice that my body is a fundamental part of the work. I was thinking a lot about the role of the female figure in fine art through history, as well as its more debated nature, right? Our bodies receive and give both lust and hatred and bear much of the politics of our society and government today, right? While the body is our common bond, it also separates us through identity, race, gender. And so the use of my body, while remaining more ambiguous through the compositions, communicates that idea of close association, the attempt of understanding myself and where I'm at in American society as a millennial woman. And through body language and objects, this narrative of burden and accumulation that many of us are experiencing today, right? So we've got the material investigation, we're thinking more about process and how that all comes together. So what does that all mean, right? While making this work, I'm still out there living a normal life in the wild, like paying bills, lots of them. Well, I appreciate my education and wouldn't take it back, but my student loan repayment is just started and it is crippling. Groceries and life are getting more and more expensive every day. while wages at jobs remain unmoved and at times downright exploitive. So I think a lot about these expectations and the burdens that women share, right? Politics, legislation policing women's autonomy over our bodies and our identity, those economic hardships, lack of health care. And, it's also overwhelming. I get up in the morning, my routine is to make my coffee and I sit and I look at the New York Times and that's how I start my day every day. And I'm thinking about all of these things and how I'm going to get by and get through life and move forward with my career. And it's also interesting to think about how these conflicts may have evolved and changed over time, but these burdens that have been unintentionally passed down through generations of women are now mine to bear and confront as a 32-year-old woman in American society. And so while these conflicts while creating and thinking about that unintentional thing where we're like talking about women and how they're passed down, how these linens are passed down and these collaborations, I think about those former generations of women's experience with life and how it parallels my experiences today. How did it not? And then creating work that questions those perceived gender roles and experiences while working through my own, right? And that's always changing. And hopefully one day I'll find resolve in my own. And this work you see today is kind of talking about that and trying to find that resolve and working through those things, okay? So I'm going to end with a quote. Feminist writer and women's advocate Courtney Martin says, "We are the girls with anxiety disorders, filled appointment books, 5-year plans. We take ourselves very, very seriously. We are the peacemakers, the do-gooders, the givers, the savers. We are on time, overly prepared, well-read and witty, intellectually curious, always moving. We pride ourselves on getting as little sleep as possible and thrive on self-deprivation. We drink coffee, a lot of it. We are on birth control, Prozac, and multivitamins. We are relentless, judgmental with ourselves, and forgiving to others. We never want to be as passive-aggressive as our mothers and never want to marry men as uninspired as their fathers. We are the daughters of the feminists who said, you can be anything, and we heard, you have to be everything." And so I can really relate to a lot of the things happening in here, right? Especially my upbringing of just constantly go, 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 constantly doing things, feeling like everything has to get done all at the same time, and being very hard on myself. And so, just thinking about that and working through that in my artwork. So, yeah. And then I wanted to end with this picture that Randy took of me in our survival skills class back in 2016, 2015. Oh, too funny. Thank you, guys.